Welcome again. Week 1, we will be talking about medical terminology, healthcare, careers, professions, paths, and an overall introductory lecture about this field. Now, I would like to talk about one of the main reasons why we should study healthcare. And the reason is that we all need it. The reason is also the fact that in order to better take care of one another, we should know the basics of human anatomy, pathophysiology, the clinical therapeutic strategies, the culture, the anthropology and history of this fascinating field, because this is one of those areas that are a combination of multiple subfields in human knowledge. So you will find science, you will definitely find philosophy, you will find biology, you'll find history, you will even find literature and psychology and sociology. There's a lot within human healthcare that warrants a more profound discussion. Now, one of the places where I would like to start is what it means to practice science within medicine. Should we consider medicine and healthcare a scientific field, or is medicine more of an art? Now, very often you might have heard of the terms of medicine or healthcare is a hybrid. It's both an art as well as a science. Well, we can certainly view medicine and healthcare as an applied scientific field in the sense that we have a direct, practical, pragmatic purpose attached to it. In other words, we study it in order to solve a problem. And this problem, it's very much matter-based, it's body-based, it's functional-based, it's not abstract. It's not a problem that has to do with a detached theoretical approach to human knowledge. Now, medicine is also an art, and it's an art from the perspective of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. So it's something that we do from a technological, scientific perspective. Now, some of you might remember the 3 main definitions or subfields of human knowledge according to this model. So you have science as knowledge from the epistemological perspective, episteme, the scientific study of what science actually is, right? And then you have science or knowledge as techne, the technology, the tools that we can utilize to in our case, ameliorate, improve someone else's health. And finally, the third part, which is as important, if not more important, is science or knowledge as phronesis. Now, phronesis is a Greek term that usually is translated in Latin as prudence, okay? That could be viewed as, to some extent, a biomedical ethics component. It's the philosophical component underlying medicine. Not so much the philosophy of healthcare practice, but the medical philosophy underlying the how, the why of the medical practice. Now, looking at this model, so again, these 3 main elements of human knowledge, we can definitely understand how healthcare is such a fascinating and complex field. Elsewhere, I talked about the more philosophically based discussion that medicine should have to have a better understanding of its structure. But for the purpose of this course specifically, I would like to mention just a few basic things to better understand our profession. Now, of course, healthcare, it's a broader term than just medicine, so to speak. And one of the reasons why it's important to understand that it's because this will also determine what type of career path a student will choose. Now, healthcare means to take care of someone else's health, of course. And the concept of health, as I mentioned many times in the past, has to do with healing, okay? So the concept of healing as well as the concept of wealth, wholeness, holiness, okay? So whole, holy, healthy, all these terms are deeply connected. And so in the best case scenario, we will be able to take care of one another from a very holistic perspective. A perspective that, of course, should be solidly based on biology, anatomy, pathophysiology, but also on all the other parts of this complex, magnificent element within human life. And of course, we need to take care of it. Okay, so Caring also means healing, also means treating, and to some extent, although it's not necessarily the primary goal, to cure. Okay? The reason why I mentioned that is not the very first approach is because rather than curing as in fixing a problem, the general approach in healthcare should be the one of ameliorating the pre-existing condition so that the human body will be better able to take care of itself. Okay, so to stimulate, to foster well-being. Now, this has also very financially based repercussions. Okay, of course, if a person is taught to take a better care of themselves, now of course they will feel better, and because they will feel better from a biological perspective, physical perspective, as well as psychological perspective, they will gain this general well-being in many different areas. If you think about the pyramid of health or the wheel of health, as many other models, but it will also save money to the healthcare system itself. The healthier we get as human beings, the better our system will be equipped to serve us from the perspective, again, of healthcare and medicine. So it is a win-win situation. Another important concept here that I would like students to remember is the pyramid of evidence. Now, when we talk about healthcare, we need to talk about something that we should agree upon. In other words, the existence of a solidly based scientific method that can tell us which research study and which research study result warrants our belief system. Okay? Now, of course, you might argue, what has belief system has to do anything with science? Science should be objective, or at least detached from the observer, and should be universally valid. Now, for the most part, at least within our field, this is definitely true. But it's important to understand why it is true and which parameters should we use to better understand that statement. And one of the ways that we could utilize is the pyramid of evidence, the hierarchy of evidence. So to give an example, would you believe any single person account that, let's say, a doctor is telling you about a patient that had a vast, complex series of medical comorbidities, a lot of medical issues, and this person gave them a cough drop, and, so to speak, magically, quote unquote, all the person's problem just faded away. Now, would you believe this account? Yes or no? Well, some of you might be a little skeptical about that because you might not see, you fail to see the connection between the cough drops and any repercussion from the perspective of relation of effects, okay, cause-effect relation chain between the cough drops and the medical problem. So in other words, it seems to be somewhat imprecise to define that as the primary factor for the healing process. And you'll be right in thinking like that. Now, this accounts for anecdotal evidence, just a single account about a single event involving perhaps a single person and a single treatment, the cough drop. Now, of course, not all single accounts, anecdotal evidence, are not scientific. Now, in my example, you utilize a doctor, in this case a medical doctor, an MD trained physician, so you might add some level of scientific understanding and inquiry in this anecdotal evidence. Well, if this doctor, she said that this is the reason why the person felt better, I better believe her because, she studied medicine. Now, of course, that is one of the reasons why in such a broad field such as healthcare, there is something that we should always keep in mind that makes us very, very humble, connected to the ground rules of this profession. And the reason why I'm saying that is because being humble is connected to a grounding mechanism, the homos, the Mother Earth component in Latin. Okay? So the reason why we should be humble is that it's such a big, broad, complex, fascinating field that there is no way that every person will be expert in every single subfield within healthcare. Okay? That's why specialization is something that's an ever-progressing system. within medicine for sure, but also within all the healthcare related fields. Okay? It's quite unlikely that to give an example, a cardiothoracic surgeon will be also an expert in healthcare insurance policies, rules, regulation, and financial aspects. Simply not the same field. Okay? And so if we study the pyramid of evidence, if we understand which of these accounts contains a higher scientific validity, at least we will be able to detect the level of scientific discussion and the level of application of a scientific method in any account. Okay? We will not have the scientific knowledge to determine whether the account itself warrants a belief or not, but we'll at least be able to be cognitively equipped to understand whether the person who is sharing that account with us has some professional validity and has some training. Now, so at the bottom of the pyramid, we'll see this anecdotal evidence, okay? We can also find slightly above that single case reports, okay? Again, in another example, it could be a nurse that will be observing a patient throughout her shift, and halfway through her shift, let's say, let's pretend it's a night shift from 7:30 p.m. all the way to 7:30 a.m. It's a 12-hour shift. This person starts to develop a fever, okay? And so the nurse will take care of patient vitals and monitor the temperature and do everything that the nurse is supposed to do, and will present to the morning clinical rounds or change of shift her findings to the rest of the treatment team. Now, this is a case study to some extent, a direct observation, but could be used for the amelioration of the treatment itself. Okay. Now we have single case studies within a publication. We have multiple studies. We have case control studies in which you'll have the group that will receive the treatment, and as an exact example of the sugar pill, you will give to a group of people, Tylenol, for instance, and to the control group, there has to be an equivalent group, so the same parameters should be utilized, kind of the same age roughly, the same medical presentation, the same parameters as far as sex and gender, etc., to make sure that those two groups will be equivalent. And then you will randomize the assignment of the pill versus the placebo sugar pill, right? So that you will be able to detect which group will have the most benefit as a result of the clinical intervention, in our example, Tylenol, all right? Now, this, of course, has to do with a case control study, but has also to do with the randomization process, right? And as well with the fact that we should avoid any possible bias in our research. We will talk more about that when we talk about clinical research, but for now, just to understand the pyramid of evidence, let's keep in mind that the blindness, the applied blindness, so to speak, to the research, so single blind, double blind, triple blind study, is what is necessary to maintain an unbiased interpretation of data. So blind as in double blind, for instance, in which neither the person who will get the pill will know in which group they landed, whether it's the placebo group or the medication group, as well as the researcher, the primary investigator, the principal investigator, will not know, so that they will not misinterpret the results. Okay. Now, of course, if we go toward the top of the pyramid, then again, we will talk more about that. We will see above the golden ratio, so to speak, of scientific evidence, the RCT, the randomized case control double-blind clinical trials, we will find meta-analysis of analysis, so multiple combination of studies in which we'll be able to detect an epidemiological curve that will inform us more on the effectiveness of the therapeutic strategy investigated across time and space. So this is all a preliminary discussion to understand how important it is to understand science if we're studying healthcare. But of course, we should not reject the importance of the person, the patient's account of any change in the well-being that they perceive they had. Because of course, science in the context of medicine, in the context of healthcare, as an applied science, it's science that focuses on a specific goal, the goal of an amelioration of well-being, a balancing act, all right? And so if we did all our studies, we study all our randomized case control, clinical double-blind studies, etc., clinical trials, we implemented the therapeutic strategy that has been found to be the most effective, and we follow protocol, and we have all our medical ethics, HIPAA procedures in place, all our treatment team members are doing what they're supposed to do, and still our patient is not feeling better. Well, now of course we need to change something. Now this is also a concept that I would like to repeat over and over again in my courses, because there is something that is unfortunately related to this paternalizing attitude that at times we as doctors have to our patients. We have to keep in mind that we as healthcare workers are there for our patients, not the other way around. Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is that we should have an interpersonal communication series of skills that will allow us to be very well understood by the population we serve. In other words, let's abandon any type of terminology that's not clear enough. We don't want our patients to feel either intimidated, scared, or simply not quote unquote up to the task in meeting us. Okay, that's very often this white coat syndrome or healthcare syndrome overall, because there's also some very important financial consideration, especially in the United States, that force an unnecessary burden on our patients' shoulders. So we need to remove these obstacles that have to do with miscommunication or too unnecessarily professional esoteric jargon that we use, so that the patient feels welcomed. And of course, part of this welcoming process has to do with the placebo effect. As we will see, the placebo effect is what in medicine is defined as this you shall please component, the component that's not related to the medical or clinical treatment element of our strategy, but it's something else that we should account in our statistical analysis, something else that plays a role in the patient feeling better or worse. In this case, the worse, this will be the nocebo effect. So placebo, the positive, and nocebo, the negative. So another important concept is, of course, patient-provider communication, which we will be talking about in the specific week in this course. Wonderful. So let's begin the second topic of this lecture. We will be talking about medical terminology. The first part, it's a very, very broad area to discuss, so this will be just an introduction. So the subtitle here says, back to alpha and beta, let's relearn the alphabet. Now, of course, the term alphabet, really, it's a connection between these two Greek letters, alpha and beta. And in many alphabets around the world, we find some connection. Here, there are three examples, a Phoenician form of early alphabet, a Greek form of alphabet, and a Roman, Latin, Italic form of alphabet. A thing to keep in mind is that all these alphabets are somewhat connected, and working on this connection is actually what is going to be very, very useful if you want to study healthcare and medicine in general. Now, alphabets are by definition connected because they are predicted upon very, very similar parameters. Now, of course, there might be some historical, etymological differences between quote-unquote true alphabets with combination of multiple sounds, vowels, and consonants, as opposed to abjads, which are mostly focused on a consonantic sound or lack thereof, as opposed to having both vowels and consonant. But for the most part, for the purpose of this course, we will focus on a broad area that are in general areas that are in general connected to a Indo-European root. So what are Indo-European languages? Well, there are languages that, of course, have to do with a core geocultural area that is linked to modern day Europe, Central Asian and Near East areas. So there are languages that we can see in these slides are connected to main families. Now, of course, within Indo-European languages, we should also include those languages that are exterior in comparison to the European motherland. Okay, so of course, when we think about the Urdu, Persian, Unani culture, we should certainly include those languages that are connected to Sanskrit, for instance. Okay, so many other languages in the Near Eastern form. Okay. Now, in this specific map, I simply want to indicate the most common Indo-European language family. So you can see here in red, of course, the Germanic family. So you can see all those areas from modern day Scandinavia, so not Fennoscandia, because of course Finland is considered to be one of the homelands of a non-Indo-European family group, the Ugro-Finnic group, which you can see here in, of course, gray, and then the Baltic states that are transitive areas, so to speak, right underneath Estonia, so Latvia and Lithuania, and of course Hungary here as well, which is also technically not a Indo-European language. So Scandinavia here, of course, the British Islands, Ireland, although Ireland has a Celtic component, Iceland, of course, and then, of course, Germany, Austria, the northern part of Italy, part of Slovenia, Switzerland, etc., etc. All this red area is the homeland of Germanic languages, from German-related languages and dialects. Now, in this ochre brownish gold, here you find the Italic languages. And among the Italic language, the most common subfamily is the Romance family languages. So, of course, Italy, the motherland of all Italic languages, France, Spain, and Portugal with transition areas. Of course, you find Andorra. The Basque country, of course, is not Indo-European because it's definitely more archaic. It's pre-Indo-European. It's pre-European. It was very much autochthonous of that part of the world. And of course, Romania here in the southeastern portion of Europe. The third biggest language family within this group, of course, in Europe, it's the Slavic family. Okay, so all the languages related to the most ancient ones connected to Old Church Slavonic, I would say especially down here Bulgarian, all former Yugoslavia, so Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, Macedonian, further removed Slovenian, of course, Montenegrin. The transition area here with Kosovo, of course, it's connected more to the Albanian languages here, okay, as well as the Arbëresh languages under Italy. And then the rest of the Slavic area with Poland, with the Czech and Slovak Republic, the Ukraine, White Russia or Belarus, and many, many other transition areas with Russia, of course, to be the geographically biggest area, all the way to Siberia. In yellow down here, we have the Greek languages, and of course we have many other areas here that are at the interconnection between the old Sanskrit, Urdu, Unani component and the Armenian or Armenio-Georgian counterpart that are technically part of the same linguistic group. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about Indo-European languages, of course, but the reason why I brought this to your attention is because in medicine, rather than trying to memorize everything by heart, which is extremely difficult and also not very effective, my suggestion is actually to try to go back in time and space and play with words, play with the sound of these words. So start from an Indo-European language, like English, and try to morph, to substitute, to verify the possible changes in a vocalic sound, for instance, and try to get back to the root of the word. Okay, so let's do this for a very common and simple word. In the next slide, we see the term heart right here, English heart, okay? And in this example, you see different types of Indo-European languages spelling out and pronouncing the same concept, okay? So from a Proto-Indo-European, kard, all right? Now, of course, in this context, written from right to left, so kard, all right? Now, the alphabet here should be a much older alphabet. In this context here, utilize the Elder Futhark runic alphabet. But of course, we should go back to the origins of any alphabet, so the pre-Phoenician alphabet. And the most ancient, in a continuous sense, language connected to this Proto-Indo-European is Sanskrit, and Lithuanian, which is one of the European languages mostly connected to the closest to this ancient root, okay, in Lithuanian. Širdis. So from hrdaya to širdis to kard. Now, what you can notice here is that the highlighted letters in black are actually the core, the root of, the phonetic root of the term, okay? So the sound krd or hrd, so kard, hrdaya, okay? Then you might see some differences, some changes over time, and those changes, of course, are predicted upon many linguistic, semantic rules. And if you think about all the work that the Grimms did, aside from their work on folklore and fairy tales, the work on linguistics that's quite impressive. And one of the areas in which you could find more information is, of course, the German concept, the Lautverschiebung. So this vocalic and consonantic change through centuries throughout this Indo-European group. So again, this sound hrd, shrd, krd as root of the term for heart. Okay, so moving on, the Greek cardia, the Latin cor or cordis. Now, of course, one is the nominative case, cor, cor, and the dis defines the genitive case, okay, the case of belonging. The Italian, same thing, cuore. The Armenian, sirt. Okay, you find another example, or Irish, Hittite, German, very, very similar to English, herz. Okay, English, same sound, HRT, hrt, so heart. Bulgarian, one of the oldest Slavic languages, srce. All right, so this is one of the ways to connect to the root of the word. So why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because in general, that's what the next slide will say, medical terms are composed of three main elements, right? Prefix, root word, and suffix. Now, the root word here is what we'll be talking about. The root word is the central part and meaning of a word, okay? So by central part and meaning of a word, we also mean the fact that in ancient times, there was a cohesion, a combination, an ontological element between pronunciation and spelling, all right? So the way a word sounded also predicted its meaning, okay? So the more you relate to the way a word sounds, the better prepared you're going to be to memorize such a word. So the root word, as the name implies, is the center, okay, of the word. And then you have prefix, okay, something that you add before the root, okay, it's placed at the beginning of a word. You do this to modify or change its meaning, prefix, okay? And then for the suffix, it's the opposite, it's the ending part of a word that modifies the meaning of the word. And there are a few examples here. In most of these European languages, you have grammar case or Latin casus, suffixes that also predict number and gender, declension paradigms, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to spend too much time here, but of course, suffix itself, it's not the grammar case. But in most languages, you have to keep in mind that the word will change depending on how you will use this word, what the word is actually doing from a syntactic perspective, the perspective of syntax in that sentence, okay? Now, we should consider ourselves lucky because English has a very, very basic grammar, just very few words in comparison to pretty much every other Indo-European language as well. If you think about Slavic languages like Bulgarian, or Bulgarian doesn't really contain the same cases as other Slavic languages have. So in this context, Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian is much more complex. Although Bulgarian has more ancient letters, Russian has 7 cases, and so that is a much more complex language. Although the article component's not contained therein. So you got this exchange. You don't have articles per se, but you have added declension paradigms and cases to make things more complicated. But again, we should consider ourselves very, very lucky because in a non-Indo-European language such as Hungarian, for instance, you have up to 18 cases or combination thereof. So this is very, very easy by comparison. Now, one of the issue, of course, with English is that while being a Germanic dialect, we could say, a Germanic language combined with an Italic strong influence through French, Old French, it's kind of a hybrid. It's kind of a combination. So it's hard for native English speakers to understand where a certain word came from. And that's why we're here, to try to navigate the wonderful history of languages. So in the next example, we're trying to do just that, all right? So we talked about heart as a word, as an example, and here we see some combinations. So Greco-Latin culture, okay, so Greco-Roman culture, Italic languages, cardia or cordis, plus logos from the term lego, right? So connected to the Latin logicus or logicus, logica, so logic, as well as locus, place, location, and verbum, all right? So the manifestation, the speaking, the oratory cause, right? The combination of these terms, so heart plus logos, so the study of the heart, okay, will give in English, based on what we learned so far, heartology, right? And yet, medical terms in English tend to be more pure, let's say, okay, more back to the roots. So instead of saying heart, they still utilize the oldest form of the term, card, and they use cardiology, so cardiology, right? So this is one of those examples where if you hear a word, it might not make sense to you right away. It might be hard to remember, right? But if you just take a step back, take a deep breath, so to speak, and you try to navigate the sound, the way the word reverberates in your heart, then you might be able to go back to the meaning of the word rather than try to memorize everything, right? So cardia plus logos, cardiology, all right? This is one of the examples. Now, before I will give you a very brief list of common suffixes, prefixes, and root terms here, I would like to take a little break because we need to focus on pronunciation. Now, pronunciation is one of those hard topics because in English, by definition, especially in medicine, we are taught to mispronounce medical terms. And so there's a bit of a choice to make here. Are you going to learn medical terms so that you will be able to understand the way such terms are pronounced within a very specific and to some extent narrow geocultural area, or would you like to learn terms as they will be pronounced and utilized in a much broader area throughout the world? So in this course, we will do a little hybrid, we'll utilize a hybrid approach to this. I will teach you the most cut and dry, although it's very poetic form of pronunciation of each letter and each word, and then we will try to navigate how those words are re-represented in an English context. And of course, there should be some room for the way they're pronounced, whether you by standardization within the British English form or American English, Australian English, etc., etc. But let's start from the alphabet here. That's the next slide. So now you can see here that this list of letters is a combination of standard Italic Roman alphabet with some other letters, okay? Some that are connected to the English version of the Roman alphabet, some that are connected to a much older and more pure form of Germanic language, such as Icelandic, and some connected to the Greek form, all right? So if I will have to pronounce this in English with an English pronunciation, I'll pronounce this alphabet as follows: A, B, C, D, L, E, F, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, C, Q, R, S, T, thorn, that, U, V, W, X, C, Y, and Z or Z. Now, of course, there are letters that do not belong in our current use of the English alphabet, and one of these letters is this funny D, this ev, that predicts the sound they, for instance, right? And this is used in modern Icelandic language, and it's generally speaking a Germanic sound that you seldom find in the Greek or Roman counterpart, at least in the way it's pronounced, okay? The reason why I include this is because, of course, there are very few terms that are hybrid between English and the original Greek Roman form that might contain this sound, okay? The sound of they or then, okay? This soft the sound, okay? Now, the term phi here, phi as in philosophy, right? It's a term that we generally would spell out as PH or PHI in English. And it's important to understand that in Greek, this is, again, a combination of a phoneme, so a sound, and a letter. The letter J here is in gray, light gray, because it's technically not the original Latin or Roman form, okay? And in fact, it's considered a longer version of the I sound, or a half vowel pronounced as Y, all right? The term psi right here could be, of course, rendered in English with a PSI form, okay? But I want to stress the importance of the fact that it should be pronounced psi, all right? So the very fact that we pronounce psychology rather than psychologia, for instance, in English, it's another indication of this twist in pronunciation. The letter thorn here, it's the thick sound, th, all right, which again, you can find the theta equivalent in Greek, all right, and should be pronounced as close as possible to our thin, right, or thick sound, the th sound, okay? So you find the Germanic version of it, okay? It's called thorn because it's one of those runes in the Elder Futhark form that looks like a thorn, and then the Greek equivalent for this sound, okay? The U here, it's also in gray because in ancient Rome, there was a transition between the V sound and the U sound, okay? So depending if you follow more an Etruscan pronunciation or a Sabellian Roman pronunciation, then you might have this gentle transition between U and V, okay? Of interest in this transition, it's further change between V and B sound, so between our V and B sound, especially in the Slavic counterpart, okay? Is it Byzantine culture or Byzantine culture, for instance? Same thing for the W, non-existing in the Roman alphabet, okay? And of course, depending on which geocultural area you find yourself, this will be pronounced either as a U sound, W sound, or a V sound, okay? Especially if you think about other Germanic languages such as German.
Letter X, okay, and Xi equivalent here, one of the things to keep in mind is that you will indeed find a letter that really seems to resemble this one in Greek, although that is a chi sound, all right? And so you need to learn the difference between the aspirated sound, so to speak, and the xi sound, which is the following one, right? So in other words, this letter in modern Greek and in the vast majority of Slavic languages utilizing the Cyrillic alphabet would be indeed pronounced as h or ch. All right. Now there are some transition areas, for instance, in certain parts of Uzbekistan, for instance, or Tajikistan, some of those former Soviet republics that utilize a Cyrillic alphabet, but they do indeed have a linguistic or cultural component that stems from an Persian, Urdu, or Arabic language, and so they will have some differences in pronunciation of h, or h. So they might have a little, declic sound right below a cedille sound right below the X. Y and Z, same thing. I left it in dark gray, but Y, of course, is more connected to the Greek ypsilon, right, letter, rather than our English Y in terms of pronunciation. Same thing for Z, all right? Depending which language you find yourself in, the Z will be pronounced either as Z or Z. So all this considered, one of the ways to memorize some of this pronunciation is to do this again, to pronounce all these letters again, as if we could find a universalizing standardized pronunciation that could serve you if you will indeed practice medicine abroad, even if you have the opportunity to work in a French-speaking world, an Italian-speaking world, a Spanish-speaking world, German-speaking world, etc., etc. So outside of the Anglo-Saxon sphere, okay? So let's do this again. I will just pronounce the sound, not the name of the letter, because the name, of course, changes quite a bit depending on which language you focus on. So I will do this exercise in a hybrid pronunciation. Now, the good news about that is once you master that pronunciation, then you will be all set, because you will not have to worry anymore about any spelling whatsoever. Once you know how to pronounce the letter in an accurate way, then those sounds will always be consistent, okay? The further back in time you go with alphabets, and most of the language that we just talked about, definitely Slavic languages, Italian, Spanish, to some lesser extent French, will have a almost perfect match between spelling and sound, okay? So if you do this exercise, then you'll spend a little more time now, but you will not have to worry about that later. All right, so let's do this together. A, B, K, D, V, E, F, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Ps, K, R, S, T, Th, Th, U, V, V, X, X, I, Z. All right. So you will see that there will be some letters that will sound exactly the same. For instance, C and K will be pronounced both as K. Now, if you are in certain areas, for instance, those Slavic cultures that will utilize a Latin form for the alphabet, Croatian, Slovenian, Eastern Bosnian, etc., as well as the Germanic part of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, South Tyrol, etc., the letter C will be pronounced as C, and the letter K will be pronounced as K, all right? So there will be some redundant letters here, but for the most part, this is something that will be very, very useful, Okay, some confusion may arise, for instance, whether the letter S will be pronounced either as S or Z, all right? Or whether you should roll the R more or less, so more Romance italic forms will roll the R completely, okay, so the way it used to be in the origin of that term, so R, and then you find some of the pronunciation, Frankish or Germano-Frankish pronunciation, R, etc., etc. But for the most part, this is something that will really help you, all right? So A, B, K, D, V, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Ps, K, R, S, T, Th, Th, U, V, V, X, Y, Z. That's the alphabet that could help you. Next one, some examples of medical terminology, and I will try to pronounce it both ways, okay? So for gland, aden or adeno. Front, anter, antero. Artery, arteri or arterio. Joint, arthro, arthro. Hearing, audi, audio, just like the German car, has the same etymology. Life, bio, we pronounce it, of course, bio in English. Arm, brachio or brachio. Air passageway, broncho or bronco. Bronchio, bronchus, bronco, bronchio, bronchus. Bronchi in the plural form in English, bronchi in the italic form. Cancer, carcin or carcin or carcin. Carcinoma, carcinoma, carcinoma. Heart, as we said before, cardio, cardio. Colon, large intestine, colon. Cell, of course, we will pronounce site. Cyto, cyto. Now, interesting thing is that you could also go back and forth between the Greek form and the Latin form, okay? So cell is actually derived from the Latin, which in turn is derived from the Greek. So very often you find this L sound that will make the word transliterate from Greek to Latin, and will also make the word sound sometimes smaller or cuter, okay? For instance, cerebrum, cerebellum, this old sound, okay? Skin, derm, dermo, dermato, okay? Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that you will hear these terms all the time, okay? For another layer of your skin, derma, right? Dermatitis, for instance, okay? Or epidermis, epidermis, right? Back or posterior, dorso, okay? Dorsolateral, okay? Dorso, it's also Italian for back. Brain, encephalon or encephalon, encephalo. Stomach, gastro, gastrointestinal. Female, gynekos, gyneco, gyneco. Now, interesting thing is that this term gynekos, it's connected to the root for female, for woman, for generator of life, and you find, for instance, the translation from Greek to Slavic language in žena, okay, for woman, okay, as well as generation, okay, generativity, okay, even genitalia, all right, so anything that has to do with the creation, with the power of creation, okay? Of course, gynecology, it's also connected to this term. Blood, hemato. Tissue, histology. Health, hemi or semi, all right? Again, whether you work on the Greek root or on the Latin root. This is also something that's quite interesting in linguistics, whether you're studying Indo-European languages and you divide them into focusing on the satem languages or the centum or cantum languages for the word defining 100, okay? Satem, s, okay? And the equivalent, for instance, sto in many Slavic languages, or centum, cento, cent, etc. in the Roman Italic counterpart. Okay, so hemi or semi. Okay, semi in English. Abdomen, lapar, laparo. To bind, lig. Now this is very common. You think about ligament, right? But you should also think of law. You should also think of religion, for instance, binding. Okay, ligamen in Latin. Okay. Muscle, all right? Same thing as we said earlier between cellula, cell, and kut, sutos in Greek. The same thing applies here. Musculo, myo, okay? Or myo, muscular, okay? Muscle, okay? Nerve, we will say neuro, of course, the ancient pronunciation, neuro. In some languages, nevro, okay? Nose, this is easier. Nose is one of those terms that's definitely connected to the old days. Naso or naso. Eye, oculo or ophthalmo. Seeing or sight, optico or opto. Now, of course, video, it's also Latin. It's also for to see, okay? Mirror, okay? Mirare, to admire, to look at, okay? Even monster has the same etymology or a connected etymology from mostrare, something you show, right? Mouth, oro. There is, quite a bit of literature between the pronunciation of os, okay? So in terms of mouth pronunciation, etc., etc. All right, but it's the same etymology. Auto, ear, okay? This is not path, all right, although pathophysiology is a term that we will all use. It has to do with pathein, pathos, okay? So the equivalent of this Greek term will be the Latin passio. So something also quite interesting, and I mentioned in many of my lectures, is that the term sympathy or empathy is connected to the same etymology here, okay? Now, one of the things that it's kind of interesting about the way languages work and evolve is that there are things that are being perceived as more positive and something that are perceived as more negative, okay? So, for instance, the same term in Greek will be rendered as pathetic. The Latin term, which is exactly the same meaning, is passionate. So as you can see in English, those two, the same term took a very, very different root eventually, and it came to signify something very, very different. But in any case, there are also some so-called folk etymologies. For instance, if you think about the field of naturopathy or natural medicine, there are some that will translate naturopathy as the path of nature, which something that it's not really etymologically sound, all right? But since naturopathy was also further developed in the United States from the work of many, but especially Benedict Lust, etc., you could make an argument that English played a role in the way this field was further developed. So either the path of nature or naturopathia as, again, connected to this sense of feeling, okay, perception, proprioception, okay? So disease is in the sense of pathology, okay? So something that's manifested externally, something that we feel, and of course in medicine, we feel something as a result of a problem. So to translate path or patho as disease is of course only valid in this context, okay? Pathogenic, as an example, okay? Pathology. Drug, pharmakos, pharmacia, pharmacia, etc., pharmakon. Lung, pulmon, pulmonary, for instance, okay? Now, of course, pulmon in itself is connected to other terms, so this is more Latin and Roman in origin, but you can think of pneuma, okay? Now, pneuma, we would probably pronounce it pneuma in English, right? Pneumonia, pulmonitis, same thing. Kidney, reno, right? Dividing wall, septum, septo. Chest or thorax. Now, thorax is pretty close to the root, thoraco. The windpipe, trache or trachea, trachea. Hair or hair-like, trich or trich. Vessel, vasculo, okay, vascular. And finally, in this example, front or abdominal side, ventro, okay, ventre in Italian. So these are just a few examples. Now, this is only the very first introduction to medical terminology, and so I will not add more information here. This is just a way to be more familiar with those terms. And again, despite of my thick accent here, I will try my best to make myself understood. And if you have any question, as usual, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to answer such questions as they arise. Now let's take a quick break here. Wonderful. So our next topic is EBM and CAM. So this is a general overview. For now, let's just work on the definition. EBM, it's an acronym that identifies evidence-based medicine or Western biomedicine, and CAM or CAM, complementary and alternative medicine, also called integrative medicine. Now, one of the questions here is, of course, well, why is there a need to have a label such as complementary and alternative medicine? Many have argued that, well, if it works, it should just be called medicine. And if it doesn't work, why are we talking about it in the first place, right? Now, jokes aside, there are many ways to approach this. From the perspective of our class, I will keep this conversation to the point and the discussion very short. I took some of the slides from other more in-depth courses I teach in this field. But for now, let's just focus on basic elements here, just a few minutes. So complementary as in complementing, not complementing, but complementing what Western medicine is already doing. So you're not changing anything, you're adding to it. Alternative, it's a more controversial term because alternative means something other than, different than, all right? So this term is a little more controversial because it presupposes the fact that Western biomedicine has some areas where it doesn't perform well, for instance. So integrative medicine is much more preferred nowadays in comparison to either complementary or alternative medicine. Now, this will warrant a much more in-depth conversation, which we will do as part of this course. But for now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the way we view medicine in the West is not necessarily the same way we view medicine in the rest of the world, okay? Now, we have to agree that in terms of medical curricula, whether you're going to school in North America, let's say you go to Mexico, or whether you're going to South America and you go to Brazil, or you're going to, I don't know, Northern Europe and you go to Sweden, or you're going to Southeast Asia, right? Whatever you go, you could argue that modern biomedicine is for the most part the same thing. So you could also see how peer-reviewed scientific research is predicated upon the same rules, regulations, and scientific expectations. We briefly talked about the pyramid of evidence earlier. But where did it come from? Well, the way we look at academic medicine, academic healthcare, in this country at least, is predicated upon a relatively recent development in education. And this is connected to the system of universities, okay? So we could say that we define as healthcare or professional healthcare taught in academic setting that type of medicine related fields as taught in university institutes. Okay, and so we will have to talk about a very brief history of such institution, as well as a brief history of the founding mothers and fathers of the field. Okay, so in the next slide we will attempt to do just that. So I made a very, very brief list here of the most ancient academic institution in the world. Now the question is, which one is the oldest university in the world? Or which one is the oldest university still operating in the world? The answer will be the same. It's the University of Bologna, Italy. All right. We're working on pronunciation here, so it's not Bologna. All right. Not even when we're talking about meat. It's Bologna. All right. It's also very important because the Bologna system is a system that to this day accredits universities around the world with the ECTS system, the European Credit Transfer System. Okay, so the very terms bachelor, master, doctor, etc., are connected to the University of Bologna. That's the oldest period. Okay. Now, this university, of course, was connected to the European medieval Catholic-based merchant, also based sociocultural components of that time. If you look at the oldest public university in the world, it's another Italian university, 1224. This time, the University of Naples, okay, in southern Italy. So you find central northern Italy in University of Bologna and University of Napoli or Naples in 1224. However, these are the two oldest universities in the world, period. But if you want to extend the term to academic institutes, okay, the oldest surviving academic institute is actually Al-Azhar Madrasa, okay, in Egypt, okay, which was founded earlier, okay, in 972. Okay, granted, this institution became a university only in 1961. But if you want to extrapolate the term of university and you want to morph that, this should qualify as such. Now, of course, the concept of university as a higher institution should go probably back in time to the theory of out of Africa, and definitely certain institution in the some Indian continent will also qualify some of the oldest institute in the world, and that applies to China as well, of course. But again, we're talking about as academic institutions the way we view universities nowadays. The last one in this list is the oldest emirate university in the world, 1434, the University of Catania, again in Italy. Italy had the privilege of being this country, at the center of the Mediterranean, and so it benefited from a lot of cultural expansion and manifestation throughout its history, from Arab domination, the Judeo-Christian culture, Sephardi and Ashkenazi and Italkim culture, as well as the Arab culture, the Norman, the Vikings, the Byzantines, of course, the Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was privileged in being right at the center of the world for most of its history, and that kind of explains why all these universities are centered in that country. Now, if you think about the most important figures, you'll see that some of them also come from that same part of the world, and some are more an expansion of the culture, as we can see here. This expansion predicted upon the connection between cultures that shared a lot of similarities. So Hippocrates, 460 BC, he's very famous because of the Hippocratic Oath, although the way we utilize the Hippocratic Oath in medicine nowadays, it's not really the original that he wrote. Never mind, he's still one of the founding fathers of clinical medicine. We'll talk more about him in a few slides. Aristotle, father of Western philosophy. Pedanius Dioscorides, who famously wrote the Greek Encyclopedia on herbal medicine, also called the Pharmacopoeia, and the Doctrine of Signatures, Very, very important. We will not talk too much about that in this course. I'll be happy to answer questions if you're interested in doctrinal signatures. For the purpose of this course, it's worth to know that this doctrinal signatures was a theory according to which certain fruits, certain plants in general, were considered to be quote unquote healthy, good for you, had a therapeutic validity if they resembled, aesthetically speaking, the shape or form of the organ they were supposed to treat, right? So that's a doctrine of signature. Galen, okay, very famous for the four humors or temperament theory, which we'll be talking about in a second, okay? Also one of the founding fathers of medicine. And of course, we should mention Al-Farabi. In the Arabic or Unani philosophical tradition, he was known as the second master after Aristotle. Quick note, the Unani tradition refers to the Ionian tradition, so not necessarily Ionian just focused on the Greek culture, but the connection really between the Greco-Roman culture on one side and the Persian, Iranian culture on the other side. Okay, so we talk about Iran, right, in the slide about Indo-European languages. It's famously known that the Iranian culture of Iran, it's Indo-European, certainly not Arabic, and yet because of the further expansion of the Persian Empire and also the empires that followed, including the Greco-Macedonian Empire, right? There was a constant flow of information and cultural shared components between East and West. Again, clash of cultures is really nonsensical in the history of medicine, in the history of healthcare, and in the history of the world in any case. Now, a few more here. And again, this is just a very, very brief history of the most important figures in the history of medicine and healthcare. Avicenna or Avicenna, which is, of course, a Latinized version of Ibrahim ibn Sina. Persian, again, Persian, in terms of Persian Empire, or Iran, Arabic, Persian, or Unani, polymath, father of early modern medicine, a fantastic, phenomenal figure. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, medieval Andalusian Arab polymath. Again, this connection between modern day Spain, that part, and the northern African culture, so Andalusia. Maimonides, or Moshe ben Maimon, a Sephardic Jewish philosopher and physician operating in Morocco and Egypt. So again, this very solidly based ancient Jewish medical and philosophical culture. Paracelsus or Paracelsus, Swiss German, I should say, physician, alchemist, astrologer, and pioneer of the medical revolution of the German Renaissance, which of course did not happen exactly the same time the Italian one. It came a little later. And of course, depending, whom you ask, is either one of the greatest fathers or one of the most controversial figures, simply because he was a figure of transition at a time where medicine and healthcare did not have yet a solid grasp on biology and chemistry, and when even chemistry was no longer alchemy and yet not yet scientific in the way we view chemistry nowadays. Okay, I also like to mention many times that the very term alchemy is connected to alchemet, so definitely the black soil of Egypt, where a lot of the most ancient medical discoveries, you could say, although that's kind of an improper term, medical studies were performed, and also one of the most important areas, again, from the perspective of the connection between medicine and this kind of spiritual, esoteric, even teaching component. If you think about Hermes Trismegistus or Hermes Trismegistus, the 3 times great Hermes, and the Hermetic culture, right? If we think about this component, this connection between astrology and metaphysics and esotericism and spirituality and medicine. We think about Egypt. All right, few more slides here. So we talked about the theory of humors here, right? We talked about temperaments. So Galen, this is one of the most ancient representation. Okay, we think about the ancient culture. Okay, so we think about all those founding fathers from Hippocrates through Galen, through Paracelsus, etc., etc. And those four humors. Now, this is very, very hard to read unless you read, Gothic Latin. Okay. The general idea here is that human beings are, as we would say in modern time, a combination of nature and nurture. Okay, so things we are born with, our genetic makeup, for instance, and things we learn. Okay, so kind of a social learned component. Okay, the theory of humors or temperaments define four main types or typologies of human beings. Okay, so you have sanguinic people, choleric people, you have melancholic people, and you have phlegmatic people. Okay, each of these terms are predicted upon the existence or exuberance, okay, of these four elements. Okay, so the humor of blood associated with the liver and with air, which is the hot and moist element. A person in whom blood predominates, there's more, according to this theory, is said to be sanguine or sanguinic, from the Latin term for blood, which is sanguis. Okay, sangre, sangue, sangue, right? The humor of yellow bile, associated with the spleen and with fire, which is the hot and dry element. A person in whom yellow bile predominates is said to be choleric, from the Greek chole, or bile. The humor of black bile, associated with the gallbladder and with earth, which is the cold and dry element. A person in whom black bile predominates is said to be melancholic, from the Greek melas, black, and chole, bile. Finally, the humor of phlegm, associated with the lungs and brain and with water, which is the cold and moist element. A person in whom phlegm predominates is said to be phlegmatic, from the Greek phlegmatikos, abounding in phlegm. All right. Now, of course, we should spend a little more time better defining what it means to have predominance of blood or of phlegm, etc., etc. Now, there are some interpretation of these temperaments as predominant ways to express certain biochemical reaction or body, not necessarily with the very amount of any of those elements. Nevertheless, this idea that there are some predominating, pre-given elements that will define how we interact in the world, it's something that you find in many, many cultures, to the point that some of these terms are utilized in modern day healthcare. Think about terms within psychiatry or psychology. Think about, again, being melancholic, for instance, okay? So we can talk more about the scientific validity of these claims that were done centuries, millennia ago. But this is something that I'd like people to remember. Now, this is part of the Greek or Greco-Roman culture. I have a few slides to indicate that this view was shared by most ancient cultures. As an example here of the Islamic medicine, pretty much copy and paste. Okay, so you find melancholic, earth, choleric, fire, sanguinic, air, and phlegmatic, water. Okay, and then combination of which that will give different types of, in this context, psychologically defined version of a person. Okay, so introvert, dry, extrovert, emotionally stable, emotionally unstable, cold, hot, etc., etc. Okay, feel free to take a look at this, but the whole idea is that there are spiritual and chthonic, so CHTONIC, from Mother Earth, so spiritual and chthonic components that define who we are as human beings, and medicine should target both sides of this spectrum. Okay, so the more biologically based and the more ethereal, ephemeral, and spiritual component. Now, few more things just to talk about this very brief intro to complementary and traditional medicine. This is another diagram. I put here the 5 temperaments in Chinese medicine. This is to some extent a misnomer. We shouldn't really talk about temperaments in exactly the same way as we saw in the Islamic or Greek-Roman medicine, but there are certain similarities, some differences. There are, number 5 here. There are 5 elements. So you find wood for liver, you find fire for heart, earth for spleen, metal for lung, and water for kidney, and connection in terms of generation or restriction between these elements. And of course, those are also connected to acupuncture and the flowing of the qi or vital force and the meridians in Chinese medicine. Okay, kind of the same idea, again, temperaments here in a broader sense in Ayurvedic medicine. So we're talking about Indian medicine and to some extent also Sino-Tibetan culture as well, with the Vata type, so ether and air, the Pitta type, fire and water, and the Kapha type with water and earth. Okay? So I think we should conclude here for now. Perhaps we should talk just a little bit about the requirement for the final paper.
Now let's talk about the requirements for the final project and paper for this course. So if you could go to the very last section in your syllabus document, let's analyze this part together. Students are expected to write a paper on the chosen healthcare area. The content of the paper needs to address and/or be related to one area or subject discussed in class. For instance, as an example, students can choose from multiple clinical medical techniques, strategies, traditions, and methods, and analyze or compare them. They can focus on clinical, medical, anthropological, historical, philosophical factors, or the combination of the above, related to the chosen healthcare area, or focus on one or multiple authors, scientists, and practitioners. An important element here is that students can also include personal experiences, individual or group session-based, with healthcare. For every statement or claim, students are expected to provide a scientific reference in the form of a peer-reviewed research, meta-analysis, or studies, journal articles, or scholarly sources, preferably randomized case-control studies or similarly valid study on the hierarchy of evidence. We will be talking about that in week number 1. The suggested amount of reference and bibliography is 5 to 7, with sources published in the last 7 years, unless one or more of such references contains a theoretical or historical examination of the healthcare area presented. Added materials such as statistical analysis, graphs, images, links to slideshows or websites are accepted, but they're not required. For the midterm exam, please write a 1-page, at least, draft proposal of the chosen topic, situation, or healthcare area. This is also due as part of the midterm exam. For the final exam, the final paper, please write a 10 pages, at least, essay on the healthcare project, the same topic the students have chosen for the draft. Students, again, can also include PowerPoint, slideshow, or other video, multimedia elements to help the presentation, but all these are not required. And this is, again, due on class 14, soft deadline, and definitely by class 15 for the completion of the course. Format. All work submitted for the final project must be submitted handwritten or typed. You have an option. Please follow standard norms for written assignments if the document is typed. I have included some example here, the Chicago Mellon style, the Harvard Reference Styles Guide, or APA or AMA, and there are a few clickable links here that can guide you through that process if you're not familiar with that type of writing. Structure. Your assignments must have all clear introduction, body, and conclusion. They must also have addressed the key components being asked for in the assignments, and outlines must have clear organization. Mechanics and clarity. All work must use correct grammar and spelling. It may also flow well and be easy to understand and read. For citations, similar to what we said earlier about the Harvard, the Chicago, or APA, or MA, if a reference is used in your project, it must be cited properly. For more information on using citation, you can also click on the website provided by your college, whose link is included in the documents. Of course, needless to say, all work submitted must represent the student's original thinking and voice. Of course, students can use other sources, but any citation used with proper reference will be considered plagiarized. So this is a very, very important thing to remember here. There is a general guideline in terms of, and a rubric in terms of the expectation for the final project. Please review this document. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. So thank you very much. This concludes our first discussion for week 1. Please review the bibliographical references at the end of the PowerPoint, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.